40 years ago, you had a televised debate on the Dutch TV with Michel Foucault, probably the most influential contemporary French intellectual. You said that you had never met anybody so amoral. And indeed, he is widely viewed as the main defender of postmodernism and moral relativism. But what is wrong with that? Don't you see that ethical norms vary widely across space and time? Slavery, subjugation of women, repression of homosexuals have been accepted in many cultures and still are. Here, it is a scandal to make caricatures of the Holocaust, but it is considered admirable to make caricatures of the Prophet. In Iran, it's the other way around. The terrorists of the Israelis are the freedom fighters of the Palestinians. Muslims think that their religion is truly universal, and Christians think likewise, but for their religion, while secularists think secularism is the only solution. Isn't truth itself, including scientific truth, always the effect of regimes of truth, as Foucault called them, that are inextricably linked to power? Isn't there something, both parochial and imperialist, in asserting one's own value system as being, quote, truly universal, unquote? If there are truly objective and universal moral norms, how do you discover and justify them?
Moral relativism, it's a little difficult to discuss. It's a little bit like discussing skepticism. There are no skeptics. You can discuss it in a philosophy seminar, but no human being can in fact be a skeptic. They wouldn't survive for 2 minutes if they were, so they're not. And I think pretty much the same is true of moral relativism. There are no moral relativists. There are people who profess it. You can discuss it abstractly, but it doesn't exist in ordinary life. And to sharpen the discussion a little, we should recognize that the concept moral relativism ranges over quite a broad spectrum. So there's a form of moral relativism which is totally uncontroversial. Of course it's true. There are, as to quote this, there are ethical norms that vary widely over space and time. And that's just an observation of fact. Nobody denies that. Similarly, every other aspect of humans varies quite widely. So, for example, human visual systems can vary quite widely in the way they function, depending on early experience. Actually, it's been shown by experiment, not with humans, but with other animals with essentially the same visual system, that you can change them radically just by early experience. Every biological system, and I assume we're biological organisms, so our moral values and ethical systems are also biological systems. Every one of them can vary quite widely depending on experience. That's not controversial. So, for example, the human visual system can be varied experimentally so that it will have different distributions of receptors that respond to horizontal and vertical lines, and that'll give very different perception. You can show it with cats and monkeys. We have the same visual system. On the other hand, you can't turn a human visual system into an insect visual system as you change experience. And this is quite general across the biological domain, including moral systems. There's a range of options that's possible. There's variation within that range, but there are also limits to the range. And in fact, this takes us to there's a tendency to move from the uncontroversial concept of moral relativism to a concept that is, in fact, incoherent. And that's to say that moral values can range indefinitely. That belief, which is held, is literally incoherent. It's based on the assumption that moral values reflect culture. But then that raises the next question. How does a person acquire his or her culture? I mean, you don't get it by taking a pill. You get your culture, you acquire your culture by observing a rather limited number of behaviors and actions, and from constructing somehow in your mind the set of attitudes and beliefs that constitute your culture. But that act is very much like learning a language, or like developing a visual system, or in fact like finding a scientific theory. It's a matter of making a great leap from scattered data to some outcome. And that leap is made essentially the same way by all individuals given relatively fixed experience. And it's only possible if you have extensive built-in innate structure, just as you can develop a human rather than an insect visual system only if it's guided by genetic instructions, very specific ones. The same is true of acquisition of language, of acquisition of arithmetical capacity, acquisition of a culture, hence acquisition of moral values. But that means that the most extreme form of moral relativism is actually committed to the belief in universal values, namely those that set the frame in which this tremendous leap from data, scattered data, to a complex, relatively fixed system can take place. That's why the extreme version of moral relativism, which is common, and I think Foucault professed it, is simply incoherent. If you adopt that position, you are committed to far-reaching universal values in their existence. Those that, just as if you are studying the visual system and you discover that it can vary over a wide range, you're nevertheless, in fact, by that very fact, committed to the belief that there are fixed, innate, genetically determined constraints that set the framework in which it can develop, and that sort of guide the development of the structure, even though allowing a certain degree of variation. And in fact, I think that I won't talk about postmodernism, that's beyond my capacity to discuss, but just keep the postmodernism, which at least has the merit of being incoherent. I'm not sure that postmodernism even reaches that far, but it reminds me of a famous comment of a physicist, Wolfgang Pauli, who was apparently a pretty acid person and used to say sometimes when someone proposed something, that's not even false. You didn't get that far.